right, so welcome to another episode of Haydorn and Watson. And we missed last week because, well, do you want to tell the audience why, Michael?
Well, there was a few weeks actually
Has it been that long?
since our previous episode, and the reason being that the internet service, the internet line in my home here in Brisbane, Australia, um, had it had failed. We just had another wet season here again, and it's usually this time of the year when we have the monsoonal rains come through that the internet infrastructure likes to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So seems to be a common thing in Australia, where it's internet services here is certainly not the best in the world, and certainly in the developed world, and even in comparison to some third world countries, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, but it's been fixed now, and so now we can get back to producing some more Haydorn and Watson episodes for our audience and subscribers to listen.
Very good. So you mean to tell me that with all that neoliberalism that you have going on in Australia, nevertheless your internet service is not up to par?
Exactly. If anything, it's probably the cause of it.
All right, well, that provides a perfect segue to what we're going to be talking about today. This episode that we're working on now is basically going to be a response to a show that was put together just recently by Dr. Taylor Marshall in the United States, where he, with two other guests, he was basically criticizing classical distributism, and the name of the episode was Against Catholic Distributism. And the basic gist of the episode was that, as what I took from it anyway, was that classical distributism doesn't make any economic sense, and if you're a Catholic, then the thing to do is to support capitalism, right? That capitalism and Catholicism are thoroughly compatible, essentially, and that anything that deviates from capitalism is a form of socialism. The Church has condemned socialism as intrinsically evil. Therefore, since we can't be socialists, and since there's only one of two options, capitalists or socialists, and they think that the distributist school basically boils down to some form of socialism, because the property that would be more widely distributed would have to be redistributed. And so that only leaves capitalism as the last remaining option. And, well, I think that basic thesis is incorrect. I think that distributism, broadly understood as that economic system in which private productive ownership, or ownership in private productive property, is not necessarily equally, but widely distributed, lies in many hands. That a lot of people, majority of people in a society, have some claim on private ownership of productive resources. I think that clearly is something different from capitalism, where ownership over productive resources tends to be concentrated in fewer hands, and socialism, where the ownership of productive property is, in the extreme anyway, in the hands of the state. It's publicly owned. So I don't accept that thesis, and I also don't accept the idea that capitalism is thoroughly compatible with Catholic social doctrine. Now, so that was my general impression of what they were saying, and the issue that I have with the points of view that they're putting across. How did it strike you? What was your sort of general impression of what they were saying?
Oh, well, Oliver, it was to me, as a practicing Catholic myself, it was quite shocking and really is, I think, very dangerous and misleading towards other Catholics, especially those who are still in the process of learning the teachings, the social teachings and doctrines of their faith, who go and listen to this Dr. Taylor Marshall, who claims to be a leading figure among practicing traditional Catholics today. And for him to just get up on YouTube like that and proclaim neoliberal or whatever laissez-faire capitalism or whatever you want to call it, as the benchmark or the what would you call it?
The litmus test.
The litmus test of Catholic social doctrine. I think it's really it's very seditious,
Mm-hmm.
and because, yes, Catholic social doctrine, via the teachings of the Church Fathers and the popes, have condemned Marxist socialism. That is the abolition of private property and enterprise, the leveling of hierarchy and classes and so forth. Rightly so, that is condemned, but also, and what this Taylor Marshall, and he is very selective. He's quoting all over the place, left, right, and centre, from various popes and church documents condemning socialism, but he completely ignores or passes over sections of those same documents that condemn, refute, and admonish the dangers and errors and excesses of liberal capitalism.
That's
They
right.
strongly condemn that just as hard as they do Marxist socialism.
That's right.
So what he's doing, he's playing these, what often people call a cafeteria Catholic. He's going and hand-picking certain teachings he likes and then ignoring others to suit himself and his own agenda and economic vision and desires, and perhaps even his own wealth, for that matter.
Right. Right.
So,
okay. Well, one of the
he's really
go ahead.
It's very worrisome to have someone like this going and proclaiming as Catholic social doctrine what is clearly not.
Right. Right. And this, of course, is partly, this is a bit of a side note, but this is partly what is meant when, we hear warnings about the heresy of Americanism.
Yes.
That American Catholics very often like to try to combine certain aspects of the American political and economic worldview, if you will, with Catholic doctrine. And that cannot be done. Hamish Fraser said that American Catholics were Protestants who went to Mass. You can see why he would say something like that when you have people that basically want to baptize an economic and political and social order, which in so many key ways, not in all ways, but in certain key ways, is at odds with traditional Catholic social teaching.
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah, well, it was, and that this American heresy is well defined, and it was condemned in a papal document by Pope Leo XIII,
Mm-hmm.
I think, in the very late 19th century.
One of the things that they say is that the church's social doctrine is not a third way, right? It's not a third way against capitalism and against socialism, which is basically the view that we're defending. And I think it was Dr. J. Richards, I believe, who made this point in the video. He was saying that in one of the encyclicals, and I've got the encyclical I think he's referring to here in front of me. In one of the encyclicals, it says that the church's way is not a third way. So this is from Pope John Paul II's encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis, paragraph 41. He says, the church's social doctrine is not a third way between liberal capitalism and Marxist collectivism, nor even a possible alternative to other solutions less radically opposed to one another. Rather, it constitutes a category of its own. But interestingly enough, I've always interpreted that to mean that the church's social doctrine is not, it is a third way, but it's not a third way that's somehow in between capitalism on the right and socialism on the left. In other words, it's not a conventional alternative. It's a radical alternative that transcends that false paradigm entirely. So, and to sort of back that up, here's another quote that I can give from the same encyclical, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, where the Pope says, the tension between East and West is not in itself an opposition between two different levels of development, but rather between two concepts of the development of individuals and peoples, both concepts being imperfect and in need of radical correction. This is one of the reasons why the Church's social doctrine adopts a critical attitude towards both liberal capitalism and Marxist collectivism. Right? So it's, I mean, that you can't make it any clearer than that. The Church is critical both of liberal capitalism and Marxist socialism. That is the social doctrine of the Church. Does that necessarily entail classical distributism as put forward by Belloc and Chesterton as a concrete economic model? No. Right? That is just one suggestion as to how the Church's principles could be incarnated. Social credit, Douglas social credit, is another way that those principles, and we think, of course, it's the better alternative, the superior alternative, because it gets at the heart of the problem, which is a financial and monetary problem more than anything else. Yes, so there you have it, black on white, and there are plenty of other quotes that we can cite, which we'll probably get to in a moment. But do you want to react to that?
Well, what we really have going on here is we've got the usual Hegelian dialect, which is thesis, antithesis. So we have liberal capitalism on the right as the thesis and Marxist socialism on the left. And Catholic social doctrine, as defined, does not align with either of those sides of the Hegelian dialect. It proposes a third way, transcendent alternative to those two extremes, which really are alike in a lot of ways.
Yes.
In their dangers, their excesses, their injustices.
That's right. Ironically, you could say that liberal capitalism and Marxist socialism actually have more in common with each other than either does with the sort of economic system which the Church clearly supports, which is one in which ownership of productive property is mostly private and is widely distributed. Right? So both in socialism and in capitalism, most people don't enjoy any ownership, or at least no meaningful ownership, directly or indirectly in private productive assets. And so the only thing they have is their labor, and they're forced to sell that labor in order to survive. Right? So they're
Yes, that's right.
either we have, maybe 80% or 90% of the population belongs to proletariat, or in the case of socialism, we're all part of the proletariat, right? 100, at least in theory, 100% of the population is proletarianized.
Yes.
But clearly, those two systems have much more in common than a system in which no one, for example, in social credit, no one would be part of the proletariat, because everyone, through the national dividend, would enjoy a beneficial ownership in private productive resources.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right, Oliver. And I sense with this Dr. Taylor Marshall and his two fellow confreres in the discussion that there is a bit of a class bias going on there. That is a bias towards what I would call the bourgeois class. That is what I would say the middle or upper middle class, professional, entrepreneurial, entrepreneurial lifestyles and modes of life. I'd say. So the lifestyles that are dedicated towards the accumulation of money and wealth for the sake of the same, and that is done. That is best achieved, according to them, via neoliberal or laissez-faire capitalism.
Right. Just to sort of drive this point home, I'm going to read two quotes from the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. And the first one emphasizes the fact that, yes, the Church's teaching is a third way, because it rejects both socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. And that quote reads as follows: "Accordingly, twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided. For, as one is wrecked upon, or comes close to, what is known as individualism, by denying or minimizing the social and public character of the right of property, so by rejecting or minimizing the private and individual character of this same right, one inevitably runs into collectivism, or at least closely approaches its tenets. Unless this is kept in mind, one is swept from his course upon the shoals of that moral, juridical, and social modernism which we denounced in the encyclical issued at the beginning of our pontificate." Right? So that is paragraph 46 of Quadragesimo Anno.
Yes.
Now, specifically in regard to this question of laissez-faire capitalism, does the Church embrace it, or does it have a critical attitude towards it? There's some it's kind of lengthy, but I'll read the whole thing, because once you are aware of this, there's no way that logically you can accept the position that they're trying to pass off as compatible with Catholic social teaching. So, Quadragesimo Anno, paragraph 88. "Attention must be given also to another matter that is closely connected with the foregoing. Just as the unity of human society cannot be founded on an opposition of classes, so also the right ordering of economic life cannot be left to a free competition of forces. For from this source, as from a poisoned spring, have originated and spread all the errors of individualist economic teaching. Destroying through forgetfulness or ignorance the social and moral character of economic life, it held that economic life must be considered and treated as altogether free from and independent of public authority. Because in the market, that is, in the free struggle of competitors, It would have a principle of self-direction, which governs it much more perfectly than would the intervention of any created intellect. But free competition, while justified and certainly useful, provided it is kept within certain limits, clearly cannot direct economic life, a truth which the outcome of the application in practice of the tenets of this evil, individualistic spirit has more than sufficiently demonstrated. Therefore, it is most necessary that economic life be again subjected to and governed by a true and effective directing principle. This function is one that the economic dictatorship, which has recently displaced free competition, can still less perform, since it is a headstrong power and a violent energy that, to benefit people, needs to be strongly curbed and wisely ruled. But it cannot curb and rule itself. Loftier and nobler principles, social justice and social charity, must therefore be sought, whereby this dictatorship may be governed firmly and fully. Hence, the institutions themselves of peoples, and particularly those of all social life, ought to be penetrated with this justice, and it is most necessary that it be truly effective, that is, establish a juridical and social order which will, as it were, give form and shape to all economic life. Social charity, moreover, ought to be, as the soul of this order, an order which public authority ought to be ever ready effectively to protect and defend. Right? So according to magisterial teaching, according to the social doctrine of the church, there is a place, a very necessary place for the public authority to set limits on the free market and also to provide some sort of direction so that the free market actually serves the common good. Right? It's rejection of the idea that we just sort of take all our hands off and let the free market do whatever it wants.
Yes.
You were talking about what their motives might be in defending laissez-faire capitalism. The economy has a purpose, and that purpose is not to make certain people, some people, insanely or ridiculously wealthy. Right? The economy's purpose is to produce the goods and services that people need to survive and flourish with the least amount of human labor and the least amount of resource consumption.
Yes.
And so, that purpose, he who wills the end wills the means. And if that's the economy's purpose, and we discover in practice that a laissez-faire economy cannot achieve the adequate fulfillment of that purpose to the extent that it's physically possible, then there is a justification for some intervention, some regulation, or other forms of intervention on behalf of the public authority, right? And that is clearly what the church teaches. So, right there, just on that, laissez-faire capitalism is condemned, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So, but it seems these neoliberal, laissez-faire capitalist types, particularly these so-called Catholics like Dr. Taylor Marshall, who adhere to that, it seems they either just ignore those aspects of Catholic social doctrine or reject them outright.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm going to read two more, just because, it's amazing how people, they don't know this or they don't want to hear it, yeah. But we will beat a dead horse, because I think it's necessary. Quadragesimo anno, paragraph 109. The ultimate consequences of the individualist spirit in economic life are those which you yourselves, venerable brethren, beloved children, see and deplore. Free competition has destroyed itself. Economic dictatorship has supplanted the free market. Unbridled ambition for power has likewise succeeded greed for gain. All economic life has become tragically hard, inexorable, and cruel. And so the idea there is that if you have no regulation, let's say, of the tendency towards monopoly or oligopoly, what happens in a laissez-faire system is that certain companies get bigger and bigger, and they end up undercutting all competition to the point where the competition itself disappears, right? And you end up with monopoly or oligopoly providers. Now I'll continue here. This is from paragraph 133 to 134. Strict and watchful moral restraint enforced vigorously by governmental authority could have banished these enormous evils and even forestalled them. This restraint, however, has too often been sadly lacking. So here he's bemoaning the fact that there are many instances where government should intervene in the free market in order to avert certain evils, and they don't do it. For since the seeds of a new form of economy were bursting forth, just when the principles of rationalism had been implanted and rooted in many minds, there quickly developed a body of economic teaching far removed from the true moral law, and as a result, completely free rein was given to human passions. Thus it came to pass that many, much more than ever before, were solely concerned with increasing their wealth by any means whatsoever, and that in seeking their own selfish interests before everything else, they had no conscience about committing even the gravest offense or crimes against others. Those first entering upon this broad way that leads to destruction easily found numerous imitators of their inquiry by the example of their manifest success, by their insolent display of wealth, by their ridiculing the conscience of others, who, as they said, were troubled by silly scruples, or lastly, by crushing more conscientious competitors. Right? Because what often happens, or what has, particularly in the United States, what often has happened is that playing the economic game according to laissez-faire rules, certain companies, certain business people will do whatever it takes in order to destroy the competition, any means fair or foul. And we must, remember that not everything that occurs in the business world is fair or decent or honest.
No,
and
certainly not.
Just because it's business doesn't mean that it's justifiable morally, culturally,
That's right.
socially, or otherwise. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm reading from one of my books here, The Economics of Social Credit and Catholic Social Teaching, which has a number of important quotes from the various encyclicals on Catholic social doctrine. Now, another point that I want to make to sort of better contextualize this whole thing, it might sound right now that we're very against the free market and we're opposed to private ownership or free enterprise or entrepreneurship or who knows what ideas people might be getting in their heads. But we're not at all.
No,
I mean, we're not opposed to the market mechanism. We're not opposed to private ownership of the means of production. We're not opposed to free enterprise, entrepreneurship, individual initiative.
Of course not.
Profit making, provided it's honest profit making. We're not opposed to any of those things. But what we are saying is that in order for an economy to fulfill its function, it's not sufficient. A free market, free enterprise system is not sufficient, and there is a necessity for the public authority to intervene. And as proof of this, this is sort of how ridiculous their take is. And I mentioned this in an article which I published recently, and I'll put it in the description to this video. Yeah. They talk, and in many cases, it's like they assume that in the United States, in the great United States of America, they have a laissez-faire capitalist system. And any interference with that would invariably end up replacing that with socialism. But the reality is that they don't have a free market economy in the United States. They don't have a laissez-faire capitalist system. Right? A laissez-faire capitalist system doesn't exist anywhere outside of maybe Somalia. Right? The United States is a mixed economy. 30 to 40% of the GDP by spending is done by some government authority, whether it's the federal government or state government or local government. I worked in the States for a while. It can be incredibly bureaucratic. There are all sorts of regulations. Yes. Tax Freedom Day comes in mid to late April, so that's 1/3 of the year spent working for the government. How is that a laissez-faire system? It's very far from the laissez-faire
Exactly.
ideal. They don't even have it.
It's anything. No, it's
Yeah.
anything but. I don't get it. These people who hold up the United States as this liberal, laissez-faire capitalist paradise when it couldn't be any further from the truth.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Which, as I mentioned in my article, that sort of raises the point, like, why are they pretending that they've got a laissez-faire system, and that this is sort of the human ideal, this is the economy that produces the most wealth, yada, 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 when that's not really what they have. I mean, they have as much government intervention and interference that they have precisely because a pure laissez-faire system doesn't work, right?
No,
That's why socialism arose. I'm not defending socialism. I'm saying that there are so many problems with a laissez-faire system that in order to maintain social stability, some degree of social stability, it was necessary, in lieu of anything better, it was necessary for the government to intervene to the extent that it actually does in the American economy. Now, we as social creditors, we think that the main problem that causes free enterprise to break down is the money system, the fact that the financial system that we operate under is not an honest system, it's not correctly designed, and so it creates all sorts of problems, which if it were redesigned, re-engineered, we undoubtedly could have, ironically, an economic order which would be closer to the free market
yeah,
laissez-faire ideal, because if you give everyone a dividend, for example, you don't have to provide employment insurance, you don't have to provide
that's right.
government pensions, you don't have to provide welfare. And all the
That's
bureaucracy
right.
that's necessary involved in the taxation system and the monitoring of all these various social programs, you can get rid of all of that. And government would be smaller and people would keep more of their income in their pockets.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So in a sense, it would be more libertarian and laissez-faire than even the United States.
Yes,
Probably far more.
I have no doubt that if we had a social credit economic system, the size of government would be drastically reduced, taxes would be lower. So in terms of the measures that these people typically refer to when looking at economic freedom indices, a social credit economic order, while not being laissez-faire capitalism, while being a distributist order, because not a classical distributist order, but distributist in the sense that everybody is given some beneficial ownership in the private productive property through the dividend and compensated price, would actually be closer to the let's say, for lack of a better word, the libertarian ideal of a free economy. There would be smaller government, less government interference, lower taxes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah. It's also interesting to note some of the things that this Taylor Marshall said, that he basically stated that distributists, and this goes back to his bourgeois class bias again, he basically stated that those sorts who are into distributism, and by extension the real Catholic social doctrine or any kind of third way economic system that questions the liberal laissez-faire economic narrative, they it just basically thought, oh well, they're just a bunch of liberal arts graduates who cannot find gainful employment, and it's probably the case, and probably the case with a lot of them, and unjustly so. And thought, well, they're just a bunch of medievalists who idealize a world of guilds and aristocracy, and with them and their education and their philosophy, they would probably be the aristocrats or whichever, and that would probably be the case. And that's another case in point where a lot of these liberal laissez-faire types tend to often be of the modern bourgeois commercial class. Well, often they will denigrate the people of the leisured aristocratic classes, or those who idealize such a thing. And you can read throughout history, just to give the audience an idea of where all this came from. That is the liberal capitalist side of the Hegelian dialect and Marxism that followed it. It came from the bourgeois merchant class, who, in fact, were in large part behind the Reformation in England, which led to the spoliation of the Catholic monasteries and churches, which provided a lot of social services and support to the peasants and the common people, and also was behind the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, and later following that, the American and French revolutions.
That's right.
So a lot of the modern world that we have today stems from the actions and constructions of the bourgeois merchant class and their liberal capitalism, which rose to prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, and then following that in reaction,
right,
Marxist socialism, which pretty well sought the same bourgeois ideals, but for the working class proletariat.
Yes, that connects pretty well with two other quotes from two other encyclicals that I'll read here. Again, they talk about private property and how you should basically, they seem to be defending an absolute right to do with private property whatever you want, whereas the church has always held that there are limits to what a person who owns something can do, and that private property, as far as productive assets, resources are concerned, actually have a social use and a social function. So this is from Laborum Exercens, paragraph 14. Right? The above principle, as it was then stated, and as it is still taught by the Church, diverges radically from the program of collectivism as proclaimed by Marxism and put into practice in various countries in the decades following the time of Leo XIII's encyclical. At the same time, it differs from the program of capitalism practiced by liberalism and by the political systems inspired by it. So there again we see that the encyclicals are charting a course that is beyond this false dichotomy of capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. In the latter case, the difference consists in the way the right to ownership or property is understood. Christian tradition has never upheld this right as absolute and untouchable. On the contrary, it has always understood this right within the broader context of the right, common to all, to use the goods of the whole of creation. The right to private property is subordinated to the right to common use, to the fact that goods are meant for everyone. And similarly, there was one section there where, in their talk, where they were saying the church never, defends distributism, or never. There's nowhere in an encyclical where you have this idea that property should be widely distributed. But here's a quote from John the 23rd, Mater et Magistra, paragraphs 113 to 115. But it is not enough to assert that the right to own private property and the means of production is inherent in human nature. We must also insist on the extension of this right in practice to all classes of citizens. As our predecessor, Pius XII, so rightly affirmed, the dignity of the human person normally demands the right to use the goods of the earth, to which corresponds the fundamental obligation of granting an opportunity to possess property to all, if possible. This demand arises from the moral dignity of work. It also guarantees the conservation and perfection of a social order which makes possible a secure, even if modest, property to all classes of people. Now, if ever, is the time to insist on a more widespread distribution of property in view of the rapid economic development of an increasing number of states. It will not be difficult for the body politic, by the adoption of various techniques of proved efficiency, to pursue an economic and social policy which facilitates the widest possible distribution of private property in terms of durable consumer goods, houses, land, tools, and equipment, in the case of craftsmen and owners of family farms, and shares in medium and large business concerns. Right? So there, the encyclical is actually calling for the intervention of the public authority to ensure that there is a wide distribution of property, both consumer goods and ownership of businesses. Now, we're not classical distributists, and we're suggesting that social credit has a superior way of ensuring this widespread distribution of a beneficial property ownership, one which would not in any way require redistribution, because it's done through monetary reform and it's distribution from source. So it doesn't involve robbing Peter to pay Paul. That should make the free marketers happy, should warm their hearts.
That's right.
But it's obvious here that what the Pope is calling for here, it's not laissez-faire capitalism. Once again, I mean, we see this time and time again. So it boggles the mind that that they can just ignore passages like these and just focus on church condemnation of socialism, and then infer, well, there are only two economic systems, laissez-faire capitalism or socialism. Socialism is bad, therefore capitalism is the Catholic economic system. And it's clearly not what the encyclicals are defending.
It's completely false. Yeah. And on that note, I think that there really needs to be a coordinated and concerted effort to refute these what I might say chattering bourgeoisie who go around teaching that that to fellow practicing Catholics, and as if that's the Church's social doctrine, which it is not. Because it's misleading them, and that excellently with good news that has been done recently. I think just last week, where a particular group of priests and faithful within the Catholic Church, namely the Society of St. Pius X, the American district of the SSPX, has just put out or published a document on their website refuting and condemning the laissez-faire neoliberal capitalism, and basically declaring it incompatible with Catholic social doctrine.
Right.
And it also proposes prohibition of things like usury, and the establishment of a corporatist economic system where you have like employees and employers, organizations similar to guilds established as solutions. But it does in principle condemns not just socialism, but also liberal capitalism, and makes that point very strongly, and refutes Catholics who, like Dr. Taylor Marshall, who proclaim that error, which is absolutely excellent and very courageous upon the part of the Society of St. Pius X to do that.
Yes.
Especially with the kind of opposition they may receive from certain Catholics, especially wealthy ones that might be giving donations to churches and religious causes or whichever.
Right. Yes, well, that raises another point I was thinking of mentioning, but it slipped my mind, and that is that the Catholic Church, it is magisterial teaching that the Catholic Church does condemn usury. Usury understood as economic rent in the case of lending money, right? So if you use money to make money through lending it, and you receive more than what it actually costs you to lend, and your profits are basically forms of economic rent. That is condemned in the encyclical Vix Prevenit, which was written in the 18th century. That is magisterial teaching.
Yes.
So again, how do you
That's right.
square that with laissez-faire capitalism? Because the
That's
only
right.
way that we could
Exactly.
apply that is if the public authority were to come on board and say, here are the norms that need to be followed by banking establishments. We want to make sure
Yeah.
that lenders are not taking advantage of borrowers.
Yeah. Yeah. Just in saying that, to clarify, just with the situation, perhaps for our non-Catholic members of our audience, that we have in the church today, which has been undergoing a lot of suffering from a lot of internal turmoil over what is church teaching and what defines it, and how we are to follow it and implement it and so forth. There are, unfortunately, not only just say practicing Catholics who adhere to the errors of liberal capitalism, that is sort of the more conservative Catholics, those identify maybe as conservative or supposedly orthodox on the right wing side of politics. But then you've got the modernist, liberal, left side of politics in the church, who then adhere to the opposite side of the Hegelian dialect, that is Marxist socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that left-wing side of politics in the Catholic Church is with the course of the way that the course of the world is going now, is slowly dying out. It's on its way out. It's mainly the preoccupation of older generations. We have a new generation of young practicing Catholics who are becoming thoroughly traditional and orthodox, and want to revive the church's traditions and faith. And unfortunately, we have some of them, not all of them, but some of them are falling into the errors of liberal capitalism and laissez-faire libertarianism and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's why there needs to be a concerted effort to correct them and bring them on the right course, so that we can direct this new future growth and vitality of the younger generation of Catholics towards what is the proper implementation and adherence to Catholic social doctrine. And this particularly one of these groups I mentioned before, the Society of St. Pius X, and other such groups like it, who are seeking to revive the Church's traditions and faith, will have a significant part to play in the future growth and vitality of the Catholic Church. This is certainly one such step towards directing the youth towards the correct implementation of Catholic social doctrine. And then many other such figures, for example, individuals, prominent Catholics such as Christopher Ferrara, Thomas Stork. Who else was there? Oliver?
There's John Rao.
Yeah, Dr. John Rao. Yep. So there's a whole number of them. Who have various different methods of implementing the Church's Catholic social doctrine. You've got distributism, corporatism, and of course, in our case, Douglas social credit.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes. Okay.
yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to mention, and I do bring it up again in that article that I wrote about free market fanaticism, is that, I think I've mentioned this in a previous video as well, one of the things that the free marketers tend to forget is that the only type of free market that delivers the benefits that, economic theory says is associated with free markets, things like the efficient allocation and use and distribution of resources, capitalist justice, freedom of choice of buyers and sellers. These qualities, these moral qualities, and also economic values that are associated with the free market, they only inhere in the free market to the extent that the free market is perfectly competitive, right? And in order for a free market to be perfectly competitive, it means that you have to have a large number of suppliers. You basically have to have what the distributists call for, which is widely distributed private productive ownership. That's the only way you're going to have enough competition in order to ensure that all of those benefits that we associate with the free market will actually be delivered. If you have monopoly or oligopoly markets, then to the extent that you have those things in a free market system, and many of our markets presently are monopoly and oligopoly markets, you are going to have, you're not going to have the efficient use and allocation and distribution of resources, and you're not going to have capitalist justice or a dollar in value for a dollar paid, and you're going to end up undermining the freedom, let's say, of consumers or of workers or what have you. So this is something that they don't seem to be aware of. They seem to assume that the free market is always working, it's, in the interest of maximizing prosperity. Well, it doesn't,
No.
But you see,
Right.
some people do very well out of monopoly and oligopoly markets, and by George, they don't want any change that might actually bring it closer to the ideal of perfect competition and a true free market, which is, so it's sort of ironic there.
Yes.
Yeah, so all these sorts of things tend to get lost in the conversation, which is most unfortunate. Yeah, and another thing I wanted to mention too is that another thing that's missing in all this is the whole role that money plays. What role does finance play in actually catalyzing production and making sure that that production is distributed? Here's another quote from Quadragesimo Anno, paragraph 60. The riches which are so abundantly produced in our age of industrialism, as it is called, are not rightly distributed and equitably made available to the various classes of the people. So here again we have encyclical teaching saying that we're able to produce abundantly, but that abundance is not rightly distributed, not equitably made available to the various classes of people. So the Pope is saying that the system is faulty, and he's saying exactly what social credit says, which is we have a distribution problem, not a production problem, and the distribution problem is dependent on, or is caused by this chronic lack of consumer buying power, which is part and parcel of an economy operating under a monopoly of credit instead of an honest financial system.
Yes. Oh, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. That's one thing that both the Hegelian dialects of Marxism and capitalism ignore and blatantly ignore and pass over is the fact that is the involvement of high finance and the private banking system, which controls both sides of the dialect. And there's a reason why they ignore it. It's because both sides of the dialect are controlled by the same financial oligarchs. for their own benefit. It's a controlled opposition.
Right. Yes, and to drive this home, and also to further clarify our own position, we're not opposed to technology as such. I mean, there might be technologies that are harmful, that shouldn't be used, or too polluting, or whatever. But we're not anti-modern in that sense. We're not opposed to technology. We're not opposed to development. We're not opposed to prosperity as such, right? We are opposed to waste, and there's plenty of waste in various forms in the existing system. But we're not opposed to any of the sort of technical industrial developments which have generally made life easier and better for people.
Yes.
But just to show you that a free market, which we don't actually have, we don't have a laissez-faire system, but even if we did, that is not sufficient for producing the best possible world economically. We can look at the American economy and we can ask ourselves, what is its percentage utilization of capacity? In other words, given all the physical resources in the United States, labor, machinery, raw materials, know-how, etc., what could the American economy produce if it was run on, at full power, let's say, 100% utilization of capacity? And, it would be difficult to put an exact number on it, but based on various claims made by industrial engineers, I would venture that the existing GDP of the US is probably, at the very most, less than 1/4 of what the US could produce if it was running on all cylinders, so to speak. Now, I'm not suggesting that the American economy or that any economy should run on full cylinders, because there's a limit to what people can consume, and we don't need to bury ourselves in goods. We just need to produce enough to satisfy our legitimate needs and desires, and to do that with least amount of labor and resource consumption. But what I'm saying is that obviously there's something faulty with the existing economic system when it's not even possible to run the system on full power if we wanted to, right?
Yes.
And it's not possible to do that because finance is the artificially limiting factor.
Yes.
And if we had a liberalization of finance, right? Because that's basically what social credit calls for. It's calling for a liberalization of finance in terms of production and in terms of consumption. If finance were not the limiting factor, if it were the servant of the physical economy and subordinate to the physical economy, then the American economy would be able to produce at a much higher rate of production than it is at doing currently, and there we can see that the problem is not, let's say, that we don't have enough free markets, but the problem is that we don't have enough free money.
That's right. Yeah.
So
it's not enough money going around.
There's not enough money going around to fully actualize potential and to ensure that everything that is produced is distributed and costs are simultaneously liquidated. So
yes.
Go ahead.
Another point I would like to make is with regards to liberal capitalism and its opposite side of the dialectic, Marxist socialism, is that both of them by nature, at least for the most part, are designed to discourage or suppress the value of leisure.
Mm-hmm.
So basically they're both pro full employment, that is work just for the sake of work,
mm-hmm.
and rather than work just being a means to provide all the necessary goods and services with the least amount of trouble or labour to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So and that is the principle of Catholic social doctrine as well, and also the principle of Douglas social credit, which encourages leisure
mm-hmm.
with overwork, and work is a means to achieving an end, and only as much as needed for that. It's interesting to note when Taylor Marshall mentioned the medievalist distributists who longed for the world of aristocracy. Well, back in Merry England, when you had the world of kings and aristocracy and monasteries and priests and Catholic faith and so forth, the average peasant, the peasant classes only had to work 1/3 of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the year were devoted to public holidays or holy days,
mm-hmm.
Where they didn't need to perform servile work. And this was in a pre-industrial society.
Right.
Otherwise, with today, we have liberal capitalism, which just is forcing everyone into an artificial rat race where they must brutally compete with each other in the labour force for survival. It's not only inhumane or cruel, it's completely unnecessary from a physical point of view, especially with the technology we have nowadays.
That's right.
To provide all that, to provide all necessary goods and services.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he is right in that a lot of distributists do idealize perhaps the aristocratic way of life, and which values things like leisure and creativity,
mm-hmm.
and security.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also, on that note, I thought let our audience know that I recently published an article on the Clifford Hugh Douglas website for the study of social credit, called Douglas Social Credit and the Aristocratic Way of Life.
Yes.
It's Et in Arcadia Ego.
Yes, well,
the title.
I'll add that to the list.
Please.
Yes, I'll add that to the description, so that they can also reference that article. One other thing I might say to sort of wrap it up. I mean, there are plenty of other things that could be mentioned. There's only so much we can do in trying to do justice to this subject in the time that we have. But
yes.
One thing I would mention is they also seem to assume that what they refer to, or what they regard as a laissez-faire capitalist system, which isn't, as we've been saying, that it's the most productive system that there is in terms of just the sheer volume of wealth or the rate of growth. And really, it's not clear that that's the case either. There have been other economies besides, let's say, the American model or the British model, which at various stages of time actually had much higher rates of growth, and they weren't laissez-faire capitalist systems either, but they were certainly, in some cases, less free than the American or British models. And so I know that there were times and I'm not a communist, and I don't support communism, but apparently there were times when the Soviet economy was growing at a faster rate. The authoritarian government in Portugal during the Estado Novo, in the last years of the 70s, even though they were fighting wars on three fronts, last years of the 60s, that economy was growing at about 8%, 10% per year. And it wasn't, it wasn't the American model of heavy capitalism. So it's not, a lot of this stuff, it's ideological, it's fairy tale. I mean, what are the actual facts? That's what we have to get at, and not...
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
What are the facts?
And we need to follow the facts. We need to conform our minds to the facts, and not sort of bury ourselves in ideological fairy tales, which maybe suit us because they protect our privileged position in a society, but they are not, in fact, in the service of the common good.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Alright.
No, exactly right. Well, I think that pretty well sums it all up.
Yeah, I think so. And
Yeah.
if people have any comments or questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments section, and please subscribe, and we will see you next week.
Yes.
All right.
Sure.
Have a good day, Michael.
Yes, you too, Oliver. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.